Well, good evening, folks, and welcome to our Tuesday night home Bible study. We missed last week. Jennifer and I both have been sick, and my voice was not good, but we're glad to be back with you tonight and doing well. This evening we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 47. Prior to this, in the previous chapter, Joseph had revealed himself to his brothers and had sent for the family to come from Canaan to endure the rest of the famine there in Egypt. There's still 5 years left of the famine, and Pharaoh has sent wagons, and Pharaoh's excited for Joseph's family to be coming. And we also saw that there were 70 persons that were brought to Egypt. Out of those 70 people, the nation Israel grew from 70 to some 2.5 million people over the 430 years, in a round figure, that they spent from the time of coming during the famine until the Exodus period, and grew into a nation during that time. That is quite an increase in population. Joseph has already given instruction to his brothers that when you come to Egypt, we're going to have to handle things carefully with Pharaoh. Would like for you to be able to dwell in the land of Goshen, which is part of the Nile River Delta, and it's on the west side of Egypt, closest to Palestine, closest to Canaan, so that in case if they have to make a hasty departure at some time, which many years later they will do so, they will be on the near side of Egypt. He also instructed them to be sure and tell the Egyptians that we are shepherds. We tend to cattle. And the last thing that we were told in chapter 46 was that every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. And that's been explained various ways, but perhaps the simplest explanation here may be the best. This probably reflects just the disdain of an urban society for rural manners. And oftentimes those in urban settings look upon those who are from the country as being bumpkins, you know. And so anyway, Joseph now is ready to come and present his brothers and his father to Pharaoh. So let's read. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds, see, make sure up front Pharaoh knows, and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. They said moreover unto Pharaoh, to sojourn in the land are we come. For thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore or severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee, the land of Egypt is before thee, and the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity, or the Hebrew literally says men of strength, or able, men of ability is the idea. If you know any men of ability among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, how old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil, or few and bad, have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, second time it said that, and they went out from before Pharaoh. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, which is also in Goshen, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread according to their families. And now we return back to the famine. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted or languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money fails, or the money's run out. And Joseph said, Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money fail. And they brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, and for the flocks, and for the cattle of the herds, and for the asses. And he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. When that year ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, We will not hide it from my Lord how our money is spent. My Lord also has our herds of cattle, and there is not aught or anything left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants or slaves unto Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other end thereof. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them by Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them, wherefore they sold not their lands. Then Joseph said unto the people, Behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the increase or in the harvest, that you will give the 5th part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your households, and for food for your little ones. And they said, Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants or slaves. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. Now back to Israel. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they, now Israel is a person, but now Israel is a people. Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so that the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. Remember Abraham making his old servant, before he sent him to get a bride for Isaac in chapter 24, had him do the same thing. Going to swear an oath. Deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, Swear unto me. And he swore unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. Now, he's not dying yet. He's just bowing down to Joseph. Seems like that was in one of Joseph's dreams, wasn't it? Sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down. And here is Jacob the father bowing down to Joseph. Whatever God says will come to pass. Well, Joseph has brought his family into Egypt. The wagons have come, and they brought them all 70 people, as well as their flocks and their herds. Joseph has prepared his brothers and instructed them what to say when Pharaoh asks them what their occupation is, that we're shepherds, and we will, tell them that you tend to cattle. The Egyptians looked down upon the shepherds, we were told at the end of chapter 46. And so now that they have come, Joseph comes and brings a segment of his brothers, only brings 5 of them to meet Pharaoh. It's not that he's ashamed of any of them. It's just that 12, he doesn't want to overwhelm Pharaoh. And also there are 70 people in all. It's a pretty good caravan that has come from Canaan, and Joseph wants to be very careful and discreet in how he presents and handles things with Pharaoh. He does not want Pharaoh to be threatened by his family. He doesn't want to overwhelm Pharaoh with his family. He wants to just handle things very quietly and humbly before Pharaoh. And he also is hoping that Pharaoh will go along with his desire for his people to be put in Goshen, which is it's fertile land because it's delta land from the silt that is washed out from the Nile River and formed that Nile River delta. It's also on the west side of Egypt, closest to Canaan, will be the most convenient for them to be there in order to go back to Canaan one day. And so he takes 5 of his brothers and presents them to Pharaoh. And of course, Pharaoh, the first thing he says is, "What's your occupation? What kind of work do you do?" And a couple of things here is, for one thing, Pharaoh probably expects them to earn their keep. Nothing wrong with that. They're coming and going to be living there in Egypt, and they're going to be sustained through Joseph. But everybody needs work to do. And so what's your occupation? It's also what kind of life do you live? Again, in ancient times, a person's occupation was part and parcel of their identity. And so he says, well, who are you? Is kind of the idea. And they say, we are shepherds, both we and also our fathers, which also indicates that this is part of our heritage. This has been in our family for generations. This is who we are. It's not just that we do this work of being a shepherd, but we are shepherds. It's part of our culture, part of our identity, part of who we are, and it also indicates that this is what we know, and this is what we intend, at least we hope, to keep on doing this kind of life. Again, one of the things that's important to the Hebrew people, both then and even until today, is to be able to preserve their identity and to preserve who they are in the midst of other cultures. And so, the Hebrew people have throughout history been able to do this amazingly well. And so they say, we are shepherds, both we and our fathers. And they say we've come, also they said we've come to sojourn in Egypt. We're not coming here to stay. Their idea was that we were coming here to endure through the famine, and our presence here will be temporary. It didn't turn out to be as temporary as they probably thought it was going to be to start with. They ended up staying a kind of a round number that's given is 430 years. The United States of America is not nearly 430 years old at this point. And so, they were in Egypt a long time since the discovery of America in 1492, the 430 years, it goes back to the early, to the 1500s, if you went back 430 years from now. And so they were there a long time, but they considered themselves to be temporary residents. We've come to sojourn. And the reason is because we don't have any pastures left. We've got flocks and herds and no way to feed them. And the famine is severe in Canaan. And so could we stay in the land of Goshen? And they make their request. And Joseph has already told Pharaoh at the end of verse 1 that they're in the land of Goshen. And he's told them back in the last verse of chapter 46 that he is hoping that they will be allowed to stay in Goshen. So he's kind of framed it to where unless Pharaoh comes up with some objection that he doesn't know about, he's put them in Goshen. He's told Pharaoh they're in Goshen, and now the brothers say, can we stay in Goshen? And so it's kind of, Pharaoh is getting the idea that that's where Joseph wants them. That's where they want to be. And it's also not right directly under Pharaoh's nose, since the shepherds, those that keep flocks and herds, are looked down on, at the very least, according to the end of chapter 46. Looked down on by the Egyptians, and so there'll be a little bit of distance, though they're not far. Excuse me. So Pharaoh says, okay, your father and your brother and there come to you. It's sort of an official pronouncement. The land of Egypt's before you. I'm making a decree. Here's what it is. In the best of the land, make them to dwell. And in the land of Goshen, let them dwell. It's kind of like they've suggested it to Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh has the idea. Yes, let them dwell in Goshen. And then he says, if you know any able men or men of strength, men of ability among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. Now that's interesting. Pharaoh doesn't just say, well, because they're your brothers, you can put them in charge over my cattle. No. He doesn't tell him because of their family connection here, you're going to get to make them leaders and in charge and give them responsibility. He says, no, based on their ability. If among them there's some men of ability that can handle it, that are responsible and faithful, then you can put them over my cattle. It's interesting how lots of times in churches people get to have leadership and get to have positions of responsibility, not because of that they're able people, but because of their connections in the families in a church. And they get to do things because they're connected. That always turns out bad. Pharaoh doesn't tell Joseph, well, they're your brothers, you put them in charge of my cattle too, because they're connected to you. Just because Joseph has turned out to be special, and because Joseph is a man of extreme ability, doesn't guarantee that his brothers are. And so he tells Joseph, you screen them, and if there's some that's got extra ability that you think can handle the job, that are men of ability, you can put them over my cattle. And so then Joseph brings Jacob, his father, in. Pharaoh wants to meet the father of Joseph. Joseph has saved the world. Joseph has saved the kingdom for Pharaoh. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph had a plan for how to get him through the 7 years plenty and the 7 years famine. And Pharaoh wants to know, he wants to meet the father of this man that has literally saved the whole country and the whole known world. I want to meet the man that raised this boy. I want to see what his father would have to really be somebody to have raised a son like this. And so Joseph brings Jacob, his father, in and places him before Pharaoh. And it's interesting, doesn't say that Pharaoh blessed Jacob. Pharaoh was regarded as divine, as the embodiment of the sun god. But Pharaoh doesn't bless Jacob. No, Jacob blesses Pharaoh. In fact, 2 times we're told that. We're told that he blessed Pharaoh in verse 7, and then in verse 10 we're told that Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Don't miss this. The story is told, number one, from the perspective of the Hebrew people. And in the eyes of the Hebrew people and those, the first readers of this, though they had been slaves for 430 years, and if if Genesis along with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were written during the time of the wilderness wanderings, during the time of Moses, perhaps, as the children of Israel getting ready to go into the promised land, or there in that era, the Israelites would be looking back upon their time in Egypt as a time of slavery and a time of suffering, a time of cruel and hard bondage. But that did not in any way indicate that they were inferior to the Egyptian people, even to Pharaoh himself. No, Jacob is the one who does the blessing. It's interesting. When you get to the book of Hebrews over in the New Testament, in chapter 7, the writer of Hebrews is discussing the superiority of Melchizedek, whose name means the king is righteous, or the king of righteousness. Melchizedek, this mysterious priest of the Most High God who blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives tithes to him, after Abraham has rescued Lot and all the people of Sodom. I think it's back in chapter 14 of this book. And then the writer of Hebrews makes this statement in Hebrews 7:7 that without exception, the lesser is blessed by the greater. And so here, Jacob is greater than Pharaoh. And we need to recognize this. You know what sets apart Jacob is greater than Pharaoh? It's because Jacob is the one who carries on and is the recipient of the promises that God has made to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. Jacob has a personal walk with the God of the universe. And Jacob is the carrier of the promises of the God of the universe. And so Jacob is greater than Pharaoh, who may have been worshipped as God, but who was a mere mortal and an idol worshiper at best. Pharaoh says to Jacob, "How old are you?" Which I guess you would, it's again, in our day and time, age is not seen as such a badge of honor in many circles as it used to be. Gray hairs and white hairs used to be seen as a badge of honor and a sign of wisdom. Today, those that have that are up in years are regarded oftentimes as over the hill and ready to be put out to pasture. Anything but that in the time of Jacob and the time of Joseph and in biblical times. They were to honor the aged ones who had experienced life to its fullness over a period of many years. And the fact is, there are things you just can't know till you've lived a while. There are things you can't know. You can't know what it's like for your parents to love you until you become a parent yourself. You can't know what it's like, to grieve at the grave of your parents when they die until your parents die. There's just things you can't know until you experience them. And a lot of things you can't experience until you've lived a while. And Jacob's had a lot of experience, and he's got a lot of miles on him. He probably looks even older than he is because he's had a hard life, and a lot of it's been kind of his own doing. A lot of it's been sowing and reaping. And Pharaoh says, "How old are you?" And Jacob says to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage or my sojourn are 130 years. And then he says, "Few and bad." Your King James or your Revised Standard, maybe some others, will say few and evil. The word translated evil there oftentimes just has the connotation of few and bad, few and hard. Have the days of the years of my life been? Have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers. in the days of their pilgrimage. Notice he calls his life a pilgrimage or a sojourn. Jacob realizes he's not going to be here forever. He also realizes that this world and this place is not his home. For one thing, Egypt is not home to a Hebrew. Canaan is home to a Hebrew. For us in our era, this world is not our home. Heaven is our home. Paul said our citizenship is in heaven. That's where our home is. We're only here a little while. We're on a pilgrimage. We're on a sojourn here. And we shouldn't settle down in this world as though we're going to be here forever. Even if we live 130 years. 130 years is not very long. He says few and evil. And then he goes on to say that my fathers lived longer than I. Of course, we know that Abraham lived to be 175. Isaac lived to be 180. Jacob, sounds like, in fact, just about every time he opens his mouth, he's talking about dying. And when he met Joseph, he says, okay, now I can die. Sounds like old Simeon when he saw Jesus, the baby Jesus, presented at the temple that day. And he says, Lord, okay, I could go ahead and die. Just take me on now. I've seen all I need to see. Jacob doesn't realize it, but he's going to live 17 more years. It's sort of like Isaac had that sort of mindset when he sent Esau out to go and get some venison, Before I die, my eyes are dim. Before I die, and cook me some venison, and I'll bless you before I die. And then, Isaac lives, he lives at least 20 more years because he's still alive after Jacob goes up to Laban's and spends 20 years up there and comes back with a whole family. 20 years later, and Isaac's still living. And so let's not give up on life too soon. So he actually lived to be 147, which for most of us today seems like a pretty long time. Compared to his father Isaac, to his grandfather, it wasn't quite as long. But again, he knows he's not going to be here forever, and I can guarantee you, those guys that live to be 147 like Jacob, or 180 like Isaac, or 175 like Abraham, they would tell you when they got to the end of their pilgrimage that it went by so fast as it does. And if you're young tonight, if you're in your 20s or your 30s or 40s, don't make the mistake of thinking you got plenty of time, because life goes by so fast, and it goes faster as you go along. Well, so Jacob blesses Pharaoh, puts a blessing on him, and of course, blessing is one of the key things for Jacob. He stole the blessing that was supposed to have been Esau's, and then at the brook Jabbok, he wouldn't let go of the angel. Actually, probably the Lord Jesus Christ, and maybe in a pre-incarnate form, who wrestled with him in the night, and I won't let you go, you bless me. And so blessing is one of the keys to what Jacob is all about, and Jacob has been blessed, so Jacob can give a blessing. And again, promise to Abraham, I'll bless them that bless you, curse them that curse you, and you'll be a blessing, and you and all the families of the earth be blessed. And he blessed Pharaoh as well. There's enough blessing from God to go around to everybody, even for Pharaoh. So he takes his family and places them in the land of Egypt, and we're told in verse 11 that it was in the land of Ramesses, which is a much later title for that area. It's Goshen is the title, and still that title endures, but it's later the land of Ramses. In fact, there's a city called Ramses in Exodus chapter 1 that the slaves, the descendants of these who come to Egypt, will be building treasure cities for Pharaoh. Ramses gives us a window on perhaps the time of the Exodus, because there were two Ramses who were pharaohs in Egypt. There was Ramses the first, who has been, well, he reigned from about 1302 BC, no, 1303 to 1302, just for about a year. Then his son Seti the First reigned from 1302 down to 1290 BC. Died in 1290. And his son Ramses the Second reigned from 1290 to 1224 BC. Ramses the Second is probably the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Remember when Moses encounters God at the burning bush in Exodus 3 and 4? One of the things that God tells Moses is those that are seeking your life after he had killed that Egyptian and had to flee, that they are dead. New Pharaoh in Egypt. And so it would be Ramses the Second, which would place the time of the Exodus somewhere around 1290 BC. Now, it's popular 100 years or so ago to have the Exodus in the, say, a couple of hundred years earlier, and say in the late 1400s, early 1500s BC. And again, there's nothing to really fuss about, but much of the archaeology and the discoveries that have been made and the inscriptions and things have pretty much suggest now a later date for the Exodus. And 1290 is there are many scholars that, and not all of them, but there are many that would place the Exodus around that time frame. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Different books, different scholars you read behind will place that differently. But I'm just sharing with you what I learned. Anyway, so the name Ramses, though, would have been the name that the original readers of this during the time of Moses would have known that area by that name. So anyway, Joseph takes care of his family, and then in verse 13 and following, down to about 26, it gives us a window on how severe the famine got. Remember, there's 5 years of the famine left when Joseph went and got brought the family in. There's still 5 years to go, and it got real bad in Egypt. And what we have, and just in a nutshell, is that the society and the culture in Egypt had to adapt because of the severity of the famine. The sale of grain prices went up and up and up, and money ran out, and so then they began to trade land and cattle, and Egypt became more of a feudalistic society with Pharaoh owning everything and the people being his slaves, more than the way the society had been set up before, with people having more freedom. Which is in this context of the change in society also that the Hebrew people will later become slaves themselves. So anyway, in verse 27 down to 31, it moves the focus back again to Jacob and his last days. And again, Israel, verse 27, is spoken of here as a nation. Again, you have Israel spoken of as an individual, verse 29. The time you're near Israel must die, that's Israel the individual, Jacob. But in verse 27, it's Israel the nation, Israel the family, dwelt in the land of Goshen, and they had possessions and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Well, if you think about it, they were fruitful, and multiplied from the 70 that came to over around 2.5 million people. If you just factor a family of 4, which would have been very small families for that day and time, when they left Egypt in the Exodus, it was 603,550 men that were able to go out to be mustered for war. plus their wives and their families. That's at least 2.5 to 3 million people that have come from those 70 in 430 years. Jacob lives 17 more years. He told Pharaoh, few and bad have the days of the years of my life been. Well, he didn't know about the next 17 that are going to be good and probably not going to be real hard for him there in Egypt. And died at 147, but he won't actually die till the end of another chapter or two. But he knows that the time is near again, and it may not be as near as he thinks it is. Just like Isaac thought he was going to die and sent Esau out to get venison and live 20 more years, but he says, he calls Joseph and says, I want to get this handled before I die. Isn't it great, when people get their situations handled before they die and spare their family? He says, if I found grace in your sight, again, Joseph he regards Joseph as greater than himself. Joseph has saved the family. Joseph has saved the world. And also he's going to have to depend upon Joseph after he's dead. And so he wants Joseph to know, I'm trusting you. Put your hand under my thigh. And the picture is that he put his hand on it so that Jacob could sit down on it. Put his weight on Joseph's hand. The idea is, I'm trusting you. I want to trust you with this. Don't bury me here in Egypt. I want to be buried with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt. Bury me in the burying place. That the same place. In fact, they did this later. They took the remains of Jacob to the cave of Machpelah that Abraham had bought from the sons of Heth to bury Sarah in. That's where Sarah was buried. That's where Abraham was later buried. That's where Isaac is buried. Presumably Rebekah, we're not told. But Abraham and Isaac and Sarah and now Jacob, and he'll be buried there as well. And so he has him to swear that he will do that. And when he swears the oath, Israel or Jacob bows down to Jacob on the head of the bed. Sun and the moon and 11 stars bow down in Jacob's second dream. And here we have literal Jacob bowing down. Everything that God says is true. All his promises are true. His promises to punish sin are true. His promises to forgive us if we'll repent and trust him are true. He gave his son, Jesus Christ, who came into this world, was born of a virgin, lived a perfect life, and voluntarily died on the cross, taking the penalty, which is death, physical and spiritual, an eternal death. Jesus died the death we should have died and paid for our sins in full and proved that he paid for them in full by coming out of the grave 3 days later. The resurrection of Jesus proves that you can be forgiven. It proves you can be put right with God. It proves you can have life beyond death in fellowship with God. If you receive Jesus as your Lord, surrendering the rest of your life to let Jesus live again in you and through you. And I hope you'll do that if you haven't done it already. Thanks for joining us this evening. Good night.